1944, somewhere in the heartland of America. The war raged oceans away, but here, in a quiet patch of farmland turned into a prisoner of war camp, the air was calm. Barbed wire fences shimmered in the sun. Beyond them stood hundreds of captured German soldiers, men once hardened by the front lines of Europe, now reduced to weary silhouettes under the open sky. For weeks they had spoken in hushed, mocking tones about the Americans. "They eat like children," one of them had said, laughter spilling from tired lips. "Hot dogs, peanut butter, and white bread, not real food." The others joined in, shaking their heads in disbelief. To them, the thought of American meals was almost comical, a strange parody of nourishment compared to the hearty dishes of home. But that afternoon, everything changed. The clang of mess tins echoed through the camp. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the air, thick, warm, unfamiliar. It wasn't the thin soups or cold rations they had grown used to on the front. It was something else, something rich, savory, and deeply human. As they lined up, curiosity began to overpower their pride. The first bites drew silence, then glances, then disbelief. What had begun as laughter turned into quiet surrender, the kind only hunger, memory, and comfort can bring. For the first time, these men, once enemies of America, realized that kindness could come in the shape of a meal. And in that fleeting, smoky moment of shared humanity, they couldn't get enough. In the first days at the American camp, skepticism ruled the air. The war had stripped these men of everything but their pride. Their uniforms were gone, their weapons confiscated, and their sense of purpose lost somewhere between surrender and survival. Yet, as they stood behind the barbed wire of this new world, one thing remained intact: their conviction that they, the soldiers of the Reich, were superior to their captors in every conceivable way. It was a fragile belief, but it kept them standing. It was the one thing the war hadn't taken. They watched their American guards with cautious curiosity, observing every movement as though studying a strange new species. The Americans didn't shout. They didn't bark orders or brandish weapons unnecessarily. Instead, they went about their duties with an odd calmness, almost casual. It confused the prisoners. They had expected cruelty, hunger, punishment. Instead, they were given order, shelter, and food, and that last part, the food, became the subject of both fascination and ridicule. To the Germans, American meals were a mystery wrapped in absurdity. They saw the guards eating in the mess tent, soft white bread that looked more like cake than bread, thick slabs of meat drowned in sauce, beans that glistened in the sunlight. There was corn everywhere, boiled, baked, mashed, and sweetened. The Germans couldn't understand it. Corn in their eyes was animal feed, not something a civilized soldier would eat, and peanut butter. They laughed at the thought. Crushed nuts spread like butter smeared over sugary bread. It was childish, ridiculous. Each morning, they mocked it quietly among themselves. A group of captured men, sitting in the corner of the compound, would watch as American cooks unloaded trays from the kitchens. They'd whisper and smirk. One man, a former baker from Cologne, shook his head and muttered, "They eat like children. Sweets, mush, and butter. Not real food." The others chuckled. They spoke of rye bread and cured meats, of hearty stews and sauerkraut. To them, food was strength, dense, practical, unsentimental. What they saw in the American camp looked like indulgence, even weakness. But beneath their laughter, something else lingered: uncertainty. The war had taught them not to trust kindness. Every smile seemed like a trap, every gesture a trick of the enemy. Yet this camp was quiet. The guards were not cruel, and the food, though foreign, smelled good. The scent of roasted meat drifted on the breeze. It mingled with the smoky air, settling in the stomachs of men who hadn't known a full meal in months. Still, pride is a powerful thing. When the first meal was served, many stood back, arms folded across their chests, refusing to step forward. They didn't want to appear desperate. The memory of the front was still too fresh. The bitter taste of defeat, the humiliation of surrender. To eat what the Americans offered felt somehow like admitting weakness. So they watched in silence as others stepped forward. Younger soldiers, hungrier men who no longer cared about pride, only survival. The mess hall was simple, long wooden tables under a canvas roof, sunlight piercing through the seams. The Americans lined up behind metal trays, ladling out food that steamed in the cool air. The prisoners shuffled forward hesitantly, the sound of boots scuffing against the ground filling the silence. The first men took their portions and sat apart, still guarded, still wary. They stared at their plates. Beans cooked in thick sauce, soft cornbread, and slices of pork that glistened with fat. It looked strange to them. The colors were too bright, the smells too rich. But hunger dulls skepticism. One soldier, his hands trembling from exhaustion, took a bite. The beans were soft, smoky, and surprisingly flavorful. His eyes flickered, confusion washing over his face. Another man, sitting nearby, tried his piece of cornbread and frowned. It was sweet, far sweeter than he expected, but strangely satisfying. The laughter died slowly like a candle burning out. One by one, they began to eat. The sound of spoons scraping metal replaced the whispers. For a few moments, the world outside the camp disappeared. No battles, no orders, no fear. Just warmth spreading through their bellies, a fleeting reminder of normalcy. They didn't admit it aloud, but the food, this American food they had mocked, tasted good. It was hearty in a different way, comforting rather than austere. By the end of that first meal, a strange silence settled over the camp. It wasn't tension, it was reflection. The prisoners glanced at one another, uncertain whether to speak. The pride that had filled their laughter earlier now felt misplaced. The Americans had fed them, not with cruelty, not with disdain, but with care. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the camp in shades of amber, a few of them gathered near the fence. They didn't talk much. Some smoked quietly, others watched the horizon. A guard walked by, carrying a mug of coffee, and nodded politely. It was a small gesture, but it carried a strange weight. For the first time, the prisoners realized that their captors were not monsters. They were men who fought blood and now simply wanted the war to end. Over the next few days, the meals continued. Each one chipped away a little more at their skepticism. They started to notice details. The way the cooks whistled while working, the faint laughter that echoed from the kitchen, the care with which the food was prepared. It wasn't luxury, but it was dignity. And for men who had been stripped of everything, that dignity mattered more than they could admit. One morning, as trays were being served, a young guard handed a plate to an older German officer. Their eyes met for a moment. The guard smiled faintly and said, "Eat up, sir. It's good today." The officer hesitated, then nodded, accepting the tray with a quiet dank. It was a simple exchange, but in that instant, something shifted. A small fracture in the wall that war had built between them. As days turned to weeks, the mockery that once filled the barracks began to fade entirely. The prisoners still talked of home, of the food they missed, But the tone was different now, softer, almost nostalgic. They had stopped ridiculing the Americans. Instead, they compared recipes, debated flavors, even tried to guess what might be served next. Some of them began volunteering to help in the kitchen, eager to escape the monotony of the camp. At first, the Americans were cautious, keeping a watchful eye. But soon they realized the Germans worked hard, perhaps even harder than expected. Together, they chopped vegetables, stirred pots, and cleaned utensils. Words were few, but gestures spoke plenty. One of the German cooks, a man named Otto, found himself teaching an American soldier how to knead dough. In return, the soldier showed him how to fry cornbread batter in a skillet. It was a quiet exchange of cultures, unplanned yet powerful. Through food, they began to see each other differently. Still, not everyone changed overnight. There were a few who clung to resentment, who refused to eat American meals unless absolutely necessary. Pride dies slowly, especially when it's the only thing left. But even they could not ignore the difference between how they were treated here and the stories they had been told. The Americans didn't humiliate them. They didn't starve them. They treated them, astonishingly, like men deserving of respect. For soldiers who had expected vengeance, it was disarming. For those who had feared hatred, it was confusing. And for those who had lost faith in humanity, it was healing. The laughter that once mocked American food became a memory, replaced by something quieter, gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. They still spoke of the old meals from home, but now it was with warmth, not bitterness. The American dishes, strange as they once seemed, had found their way into their routine, into their comfort. One evening, as they sat around the tables, one soldier lifted his spoon and said softly, "It's not so bad, this food." The others chuckled, not mockingly this time, but with shared understanding. Another added, "It tastes better when you're not hungry." There was truth in that, deep human truth. The food itself hadn't changed. They had. It's strange how something as simple as a meal can bridge the deepest divides. How flavor can soften hatred and warmth can dissolve fear. For these men, who once believed they were the superior ones, American food had become a teacher, not just of taste, but of humility. They had mocked it, refused it, even laughed at it. But in the end, they had eaten it with the same hunger, the same gratitude, as any man who has known suffering. And in that quiet camp, surrounded by fences and guarded watchtowers, a small miracle unfolded. Not one of politics or power, but of humanity rediscovered over steaming plates of food. When the first taste broke through the noise of pride, something subtle yet powerful shifted in the camp. The air, once filled with suspicion and quiet contempt, grew still. The sound of spoons scraping against metal was the only rhythm breaking the silence. The men who had once mocked American food now sat in disbelief, as though the act of eating had turned into a quiet confession. They had mocked the idea of these meals, ridiculed the flavors before even tasting them. But now, as warmth spread through their bodies, the mockery felt hollow. The beans were soft, almost melting against their tongues, flavored with a smoky depth that came from slow cooking and care. The bread was light, nothing like the dense, dark loaves of home, yet somehow comforting. The meat was tender, rich with juices, salted just enough to remind them of the feasts they once shared in their villages. They weren't eating luxury, they were eating sincerity. And that, in a way, was more nourishing than anything else. For men who had spent years living on rations, who had watched comrades gnaw on stale crusts in frozen trenches, This was more than food. It was mercy. The meal itself was simple, but the meaning behind it was staggering. Here they were, prisoners, enemies of the United States, and yet the food before them wasn't a punishment. It wasn't designed to humiliate. It was meant to sustain. At first, they didn't know how to respond. Some ate in silence, still glancing around as if expecting the kindness to be snatched away. Others, more hesitant, took small bites, testing not just the flavor, but the intention behind it. A few of the older men closed their eyes as they chewed, perhaps remembering their families, their wives, the warm kitchens they had left behind. Food had always carried memory, and this meal, foreign as it was, awakened something deeply human in them. As the days went on, the meals continued with remarkable consistency. Each one arrived at the same hour, steaming and fragrant. Breakfast brought eggs, coffee, and bread. Lunch meant hearty soups or meat stews. Dinner, though simpler, was warm and filling. For the prisoners, this reliability was almost unsettling at first. They had grown used to uncertainty, to hunger as a weapon. Yet here the Americans kept feeding them, not as propaganda, not as charity, but as duty. There was something profoundly humbling in that. In the evenings, when the sky turned amber and shadows lengthened across the camp, the scent of food became a kind of comfort. It drifted through the barbed wire, mingling with the faint sounds of laughter from the guards' quarters. The Germans would stand near the mess tent, drawn by instinct, their eyes following the rising smoke from the kitchen stoves. Hunger, once a punishment, had become a bridge. Soon, the act of eating began to reshape the rhythm of camp life. The prisoners, once scattered and withdrawn, began gathering in groups during mealtime. They shared what little they had, trading bread for beans, bits of meat for coffee. They spoke less about the war and more about the small details of taste. How the bread was sweeter than they were used to. How the meat carried a strange but pleasant flavor. It was a quiet education in humility and adaptation. Even those who refused at first eventually gave in. One man, a tall sergeant named Franz, had vowed he'd never eat enemy food. For days, he kept to himself, chewing on the cold rations he'd saved from capture. But hunger is patient, and pride has limits. One afternoon, as the others lined up, Franz found himself watching the ladles of stew being poured, thick, steaming, rich with vegetables. The smell filled his senses, earthy and honest. That day, he took a tray. He didn't say a word, he just ate. Later that night, someone heard him whisper, almost to himself, "It tastes like home, but different." The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't demand gratitude. They simply kept serving. Some of the guards were veterans themselves, men who had fought hard battles and lost brothers. They knew the enemy had families, had hunger, had souls. To them, feeding prisoners was not about politics. It was about decency. One of the cooks, a young man named Miller, often lingered at the serving line longer than the others. He'd smile faintly when a prisoner looked up with surprise after tasting something good. Once, a German soldier tried to thank him in broken English, saying, "Good, very good." Miller just nodded, tapping the ladle against the tray, replying, "Everyone deserves a hot meal." It was moments like that, small, almost invisible gestures, that began to thaw the ice between both sides. In time, mealtime became the quiet heart of the camp. It was where the noise of war seemed to fade, replaced by something universal. Food had stripped away the uniforms, the ideologies, the rhetoric. There were no victors or vanquished at that table, only men who had survived long enough to feel hunger and gratitude in the same breath. They began noticing the little details, the way the cooks layered flavor, how the bread crust crackled, how the coffee steamed in the cold morning air. Some of the prisoners even started offering to help with cleanup after meals, if only to linger in the warmth of the kitchen. At first, the Americans refused. Rules were rules. But eventually, trust began to grow. A few were allowed to assist under watch. They peeled potatoes, scrubbed pans, stirred soups. And in that shared labor, walls of language and allegiance seemed to crumble. There were few words exchanged, but plenty understood. A nod, a half smile, a piece of bread passed without comment. These became the quiet conversations of men who no longer saw each other as faceless enemies. Outside the kitchen, the change was just as visible. The camp, which had once been lined with rigid, expressionless faces, began to show signs of life. Some of the prisoners started whistling as they worked. Others hummed old folk songs while tending to chores. Mealtime had become a rhythm that reminded them of normalcy, of something beyond fences and uniforms. And the Americans noticed it too. The guards saw fewer fights, fewer arguments. The mood was lighter. There was even laughter now, soft, uncertain, but genuine. The sound of it carried across the camp like something fragile rediscovering itself. Still, beneath that growing peace, the memory of what had come before lingered. Every prisoner carried his own scars. The bombings, the marches, the losses. Food couldn't erase that, but it softened the edges. It gave them a pause, a moment to breathe, to remember that they were still alive, still capable of feeling something other than fear or hate. There was one particular afternoon that remained etched in many of their memories. The sky was overcast, a storm threatening in the distance. The cook served thick bean soup that day, rich with smoked meat and vegetables. The men ate under the shelter, the sound of rain tapping against the canvas. It was warm, filling, and oddly peaceful. One of the older soldiers, a farmer before the war, murmured, "If my wife could smell this, she would think I was home." That quiet admission spread like a ripple. Heads nodded, no one spoke much after that. The war, the defeat, the separation, it all fell away for a fleeting moment, replaced by something simpler. As days turned into weeks, mealtime became the one constant in their new existence. The prisoners began to anticipate it, not just for the food, but for the feeling it brought. It wasn't happiness, not exactly, but it was close to it, a flicker of warmth in a world that had gone cold. The Americans noticed the change too. They saw how the prisoners lined up earlier, how they handled their plates carefully, even cleaned up after themselves without being told. Something unspoken passed between them all. A quiet understanding that survival was no longer just about enduring. It was about reclaiming the small pieces of humanity that war had tried to erase. When the evenings came, the smell of food lingered long after the last tray was cleared. It hung in the air with the faint hum of crickets and the distant sound of guards talking near the watchtowers. The camp felt less like a cage and more like a reluctant sanctuary. The men who once sneered at American food now found themselves longing for it, not out of greed but gratitude. Food had become memory. Each meal reminded them that the world beyond war still existed. Somewhere far from this camp, families still cooked, laughter still filled homes, and life still went on. For the first time since capture, the prisoners began to imagine that they might one day return to that world. And maybe, just maybe, carry a piece of this strange kindness with them. Some even wrote about it. Letters that never made it past the censors carried words of quiet awe. "They feed us well," one wrote. "It's strange. They treat us like men." Another scrawled, "Their food is simple, but it makes me feel something I had forgotten." The war outside continued, indifferent to these small acts of grace. But inside the camp, something profoundly human had taken root. Pride had turned to curiosity, curiosity to understanding, and understanding, slowly, to respect. It wasn't that the prisoners suddenly loved American food. It was that they saw in it a kind of generosity that transcended sides. It was the realization that compassion could exist even in the heart of conflict, that sometimes peace began not with treaties or speeches, but with a bowl of soup passed across an invisible line. As winter came and frost crept along the fences, the camp meals grew heartier. The cooks added more meat, more warmth to the pots. The prisoners would gather close, their breath fogging in the air, as they waited for their turn. Each tray was a small defiance against the cold, against the war itself. And every time they sat down to eat, they remembered that first silence, that first hesitant bite that shattered the walls of pride. What had once been laughter had turned into reverence. What had once been mockery had become gratitude. They didn't speak it aloud. They didn't have to. It was there in the way they cleaned their plates, in the quiet nods they gave to the guards, in the shared understanding that a small act of kindness had done what no bullet or speech ever could. It had made them human again. Weeks passed, and the transformation within the camp was almost invisible at first. A slow thawing that only became clear when one looked back. The laughter that had once mocked American food was gone, replaced by something warmer, softer, and more genuine. The prisoners no longer spoke of enemy meals with derision. Now they spoke of them with curiosity, even affection. The act of eating had become something sacred, a brief return to humanity in a place built from the bones of war. The camp itself began to feel different. The tension that once hung over every interaction had loosened. The guards, who had started out wary and strict, began to see the prisoners less as threats and more as men. The Germans, once stiff and withdrawn, began to greet the guards with quiet nods or muttered words of thanks. These were not grand gestures, just small acknowledgments of respect, but in a world defined by hostility, they carried immense meaning. Each meal had become a ritual. The clang of mess tins, the rhythmic ladle of stew, the scent of food rising through the cool air. These sounds and smells marked the passing of time in a place where days once blurred into one another. The men came to anticipate them, not just for the nourishment, but for the familiarity. The kitchen, once viewed with suspicion, now felt like the beating heart of the camp. In the evenings, when the sun dipped below the horizon and the air cooled, the prisoners would gather around the wooden tables in clusters. They shared food, stories, and sometimes even laughter. The laughter was different now, not cruel or mocking, but human and free. It filled the gaps between their broken spirits and gave shape to a new kind of camaraderie. They laughed not at the Americans anymore, but with each other, with the relief that came from remembering what it was like to simply be alive. One could see the change even in the smallest of gestures. The men, who once ate hurriedly with suspicion in their eyes, now took their time. They passed the bread down the table, offered portions to those who had less, and saved small pieces for those too sick to stand in line. The meals had created something unspoken, a sense of dignity, even in captivity. They had found a reason to care for one another again. The American soldiers noticed it too. Many of them had been skeptical at first, expecting the prisoners to remain resentful or violent. But as the weeks went on, they saw something unexpected: gratitude. It came in the form of shy smiles, polite nods, and the occasional "thank you," uttered in broken English. For the guards who had seen the worst of war, this simple decency was disarming. They had been taught to hate their enemy, yet here they were, feeding them, and watching them transform through the act of kindness. There were small exchanges that spoke louder than any speech could. One day, a guard named Cooper noticed a prisoner struggling to carry a heavy pot of water back to the kitchen. Without hesitation, Cooper stepped forward to help. The two men worked in silence, their breaths visible in the morning cold. When the task was done, the prisoner looked at him hesitant, then offered his hand. Cooper shook it. No words were exchanged, none were needed. Moments like that began to multiply. As food continued to bridge the unspoken distance between captor and captive, something remarkable happened. Curiosity replaced resentment. Some of the German prisoners started asking about the recipes, about the ingredients they couldn't name. They marveled at how Americans used sugar in bread, or how they cooked beans with meat instead of serving them plain. To them it was strange but fascinating. They wanted to learn. In time, the Americans let a few of the prisoners into the kitchen under watch. What started as supervision quickly became cooperation. The Germans chopped vegetables, cleaned utensils, and even offered advice on preparation. One of them, Otto, a former cook from Munich, began to share little secrets from home. How to season meat with onion skins for richer flavor, how to stretch flour with potato starch. The Americans listened, intrigued. The kitchen became a strange blend of two worlds, where the smell of American stew met the aroma of German spice. This quiet collaboration did more than fill stomachs. It mended something deeper. It reminded everyone involved that even in the darkest of times, people could create together. They could share warmth, effort, and care. The food no longer tasted like one nation or another. It tasted like peace. Evenings grew livelier. Under the dim glow of lanterns, the camp mess hall began to echo with laughter and chatter. The prisoners, once hollow-eyed and grim, began to find joy in the smallest things. The crunch of fresh bread, the warmth of soup, the unexpected sweetness of fruit. They started telling stories again. Some spoke of their homes, small towns in Bavaria or the Rhineland, of their mothers' kitchens, of harvest festivals, of meals that once defined life before the war. The Americans listened. Some shared their own stories, of farmhouses in Iowa, of mothers who baked pies on Sundays, of winters where the only warmth came from food and family. Slowly, both sides realized something profound. Despite everything, they were not so different. They missed the same comforts, longed for the same peace, and cherished the same memories of food, love, and home. There was one night in particular that would never be forgotten. The camp's generator had failed, plunging everything into darkness. The kitchen lanterns flickered faintly, throwing long shadows across the tables. The prisoners and guards sat together, their faces illuminated by the soft, golden light of the flames. Outside, the wind howled through the wires, but inside, it was warm. Someone began humming an old German folk tune, slow, melancholic, beautiful. To everyone's surprise, an American soldier recognized the melody. His grandmother had sung it years ago in her own kitchen. Without a word, he joined in. The song carried through the dark, gentle and fragile. By the time it ended, the camp was silent. Some of the men had tears in their eyes, not out of sorrow, but because, for that brief moment, they had remembered their shared humanity. The next morning, things felt different. The barriers that war had built, fear, hatred, pride had begun to crumble for good. The Germans no longer avoided the guards' gaze. The Americans no longer looked at them as enemies. Mealtime became something like communion, a reminder that even amidst captivity, life could hold meaning. Soon, there were small acts of kindness everywhere. A guard shared his cigarette with a prisoner. A prisoner mended a torn uniform sleeve for an American. A group of POWs built extra benches for the mess tent. The Americans, in turn, saved bits of food for those who were ill. It was as if, through this shared rhythm of eating and working, the men had found a way to rewrite the rules of war within the fence lines. By the third month, the camp felt transformed. The once silent mess hall now echoed with laughter, conversation, and even the occasional song. The smell of food, beans, cornbread, stew, drifted beyond the camp boundaries, mixing with the scent of pine and soil. Even passing supply convoys would slow down, drawn by the sound of life returning where it wasn't expected. And the Germans, those once defiant soldiers who had sneered at American food, had changed in ways they never imagined. They were no longer eating because they had to. They ate because they wanted to. They savored the flavors, asked for seconds, and sometimes even offered compliments to the cooks. The food had stopped being a reminder of defeat and had become a symbol of survival. More importantly, it became a lesson. Each plate, each meal, was proof that compassion could disarm pride, that warmth could quiet anger, that something as simple as sharing bread could restore faith in humanity. One of the prisoners, an older man named Dieter, had been among the most stubborn. He rarely spoke, rarely smiled. But one evening, as he finished his meal, he said softly to the man beside him, "When the war is over, I will tell my son that kindness tastes like this." His words spread quietly through the camp, repeated from man to man like a prayer. That winter, when snow finally dusted the campgrounds, the food became even more precious. The Americans prepared hot soups and stews to keep everyone warm. The Germans helped by chopping wood and hauling water, their breath clouding in the frozen air. Mealtime became the heart of every day. A moment when the cold couldn't reach them, when even the most weary found a flicker of warmth inside. The nights grew long, but inside the mess hall, light and laughter endured. The men played makeshift games, told stories, and sometimes, in moments of rare honesty, spoke of the futures they hoped for. The families they longed to see again, the peace they prayed would last. In those conversations, one truth shone clear: the war had taken everything from them. But through something as small as a meal, they had found a way to feel human again. The Americans had given them food, but what they had really given was dignity, something that no army or ideology could destroy. By spring, when the days grew warmer and rumors of the war's end began to reach the camp, the prisoners were no longer the same men who had first arrived. The laughter that now filled the air was the laughter of gratitude, not arrogance. They had come as enemies, but they would leave with something far more valuable than victory. They would leave with understanding. The last meal many of them shared before release was remembered for years. The Americans served them extra portions, thick stew, fresh bread, and even slices of pie. As they ate, the men looked around, trying to memorize every detail. The sunlight through the tent canvas, the smell of the food, the quiet peace in the air. When it was time to go, many of them turned back before stepping beyond the gates. They nodded to the guards, to the cooks, to the men who had shown them that compassion could survive even in war's darkest corners. They had laughed at American food once. They had mocked its simplicity, its sweetness, its foreignness. But now, as they walked toward freedom, they carried the memory of it like a talisman, the taste of kindness, of redemption, of shared humanity. And long after the fences rusted and the camp was forgotten by history, that memory lived on, in stories told quietly at kitchen tables, in the smell of bread baking on a Sunday morning, in the understanding that sometimes the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but around a table where enemies become men again.